If I have an idea for a stained glass window and I get out my paper and I draw it, the time it takes to design it and then find the glass, cut the glass, lead it together, you charge accordingly, your time and materials, and you come up with a price. With an old stained glass window, you're taking rubbings of it to get your design, and you're kind of working backwards. You take it apart and you're dealing with the broken glass, and you're dealing with the craftsman who originally made the window who might not have been great, and so then pieces aren't fitting the same way you would like them to fit. And then you're fabricating the window a second time after you've cleaned it and organized it and kept track of everything as you take it apart. So the time spent is way more time to restore a window, in my mind, than it is to start from scratch to make a window. The exception being a stained glass window where there's the painting and staining on the window. So, yeah. So, to keep you interested and occupied, I'm going to just start passing these things around. This is out of a stained glass window in Portland, a Povey window, Christ the Shepherd. And I have a slide of it also. But his face got hit with probably a slingshot from the look of that. That's more impact than a BB. I don't think it's a bullet hole, or it would have been powderized around it. So Sherlock Holmes is deciding this was more like a slingshot. When I replaced the face, I painted some copies. Look at those and pass them around. I usually paint like 3 or 4 faces, and then the best one goes back into the church. And the other ones that might be a little cross-eyed or something, those stay at the studio. So the one with the lead around it is the one that didn't go into the window. The best one went into the window. And the face probably has 5 firings. So there's tracing and matting, and then enamels and different colors of enamels. And so each one of those requires a different firing in the kiln. And that's the style that the Povey brothers locally employed in making their windows, their faces. These are 2 other faces for Povey window repairs, actually, of the little body of Christ. So there's a medallion area, an oval, and it'll have Christ talking to the multitudes. And then the next window over will have a medallion with baby Moses in the reeds, and he's being taken out of the water. So all these pictures were done for churches, promoted by people in the church that want to donate. And what they're asked, what do you want to see in your window? Well, they've had King James Bibles illustrated with certain designers, William Holman Hunt and Heinrich, what was his last name? Anyway, these great illustrators in Germany and England, when color printing became popular, Bibles were mass produced with these same designs in them, same story pictures. And so Christ the Shepherd, and then Christ the Child in the temple. And you can just go through churches and see these same designs done over and over and over. And the Povey brothers did them also, and these faces are from multiple windows in Portland that have been broken and I've repaired. What's interesting also for you to keep in mind when you look at stained glass windows is a piece of glass like this can be almost black, but when it becomes the light source for a room, it can really get bright. And so what's always surprising is when you go to a church and say there's a hole in it from a slingshot, and you get down on your hands and knees and look around the pews, and you find the little shards and you hold them up and they're just black. Well, if you realize there's as much light hitting it from this side as there is from the back side, and the light needs to come through it to light that piece of glass up. So if you could get it onto a light box with a big piece of cardboard and just punch a hole in the cardboard and lay your little shard there, it will light up and give you a good example of what the color is. This piece is also an example of that. This is something that was broken that I replaced. I painted a replacement for it, but was just shocked at how dark it was in my studio. But in the church, this is a bright amber in the design of the rest of the glass around it is even way darker than this. On the same token, here's a window that, a piece of glass that this is from New York, from the turn of the century. And these artists took a piece of clear glass and then painted a white obscuring glass stain with some yellow enamel in it on the back side. And then on the front side, they had black tracing and brown matting. And it's all starting to dissolve due to age and the severity of the weather. Combination of pollution in the air and the moisture in the air starts to dissolve the stain. This is a piece of glass here with lots of Scotch tape on the back to hold it together. This came out of a church that I restored their windows, and this was a previous repair. And when you look at the backside, you can see where the slingshot, marble, lead shot, whatever it was, went through the window and punched a hole. And then the repair person got up and back in the day when they're probably, let's say it's 1940, and the Depression had wiped out all the stained glass studios, and so there was nobody to repair this window. The handyman got up with his tar and just filled this hole with tar. We see those a lot, and usually they're up really high where people really can't see what the technique was used to stop the light from coming through. This is a caramel opalescent glass, and it's got enamel staining on the front and nothing on the back. And these pieces came out of a skylight. They're of oak leaves and acorns, and they're the border pieces that go around a skylight up above the head of the sanctuary. And so to access this, we had to go up into the attic and pull this panel out. And it was amazing how much broken glass was up above the heads of the people in the church. I don't think anybody ever really knew it. So our glass furnaces, if we take our basic potash and soda and silica and melt it down, we're going to come up with a clear. Glass oftentimes works like an acid. It dissolves whatever it's next to. Since it's like a lava, it's super hot, and it's a liquid, it's dissolving the furnace walls or the steel crucible or the ceramic crucible. And so you never really get a pure clear. There's always some type of contaminant in it. But other than that, if you start adding your metal oxides and stirring it in, you can make different colors of glass, and those would be called pot metal. So it was the invention of the blowing glass, so they could blow these bubbles and blow out of one furnace a bubble of clear, and then go to another furnace and dip your bubble in there and put a coating of red on top of your clear. And that makes a flashed glass. And flashed glass is two layers. The host glass is clear, and the extra layer they put on is a thin layer of red. And I chipped the edge here so you can see that that's what this is, how this is made. If you want to then grind through the red glass and expose the clear, you can get some detail into the piece of glass without painting and firing it. So that can be acid etching or sandblasting to accomplish that. And it just depends upon the color of the glass in your furnace as to what color your flash glass is going to be. Thank you. So flash glass is pretty rare because it has to be made by a studio that blows glass, not a studio that rolls glass. And there is a studio in Seattle called Fremont, and it's because they're in the Fremont neighborhood. But Jim, I forget his last name, blows huge bubbles. He can make a bubble this long and about that big around, and then slit it and open it up into a sheet of glass. And so that's the type of glass that emulates and looks like medieval blown glass. And that red glass, when the red flash glass is a blown glass. And so you can see it's very transparent. And the reason for that is anytime you take glass out, say you scoop glass out of your furnace and throw it on a steel table and take a steel rolling pin and squeeze it out into a sheet of glass, you get the texture of the roller and the texture of the steel table. And the glass is, say it's 1500 degrees. When it hits that cold steel, it gets a skin on it. It starts to harden real quick. And that skin starts to coagulate. And the inside of the sheet is still hot and moves a little bit. So then you get this real wrinkled, strange texture. And that's even on the smooth side. So this glass, when I pass it around, the top side of the glass will be nice and shiny because it was exposed to the air and stayed hotter longer. This side was down on the steel table and got colder quicker, so it got the skin on it. Blown glass, when you blow your bubble, you're constantly putting it back into the flame and keeping it soft and bringing it out and working it and putting it back in. It doesn't touch the tabletop, and it stays fire polished and nice and sparkly, shiny, clear. So that's why blown glass is optically really exciting glass to work with, if that's the effect you want. If you're doing a window for the bathroom, you don't want blown glass in there. Otherwise, you will be on display. So here's another piece of red glass, ruby red, and this is blown, but this one's not flashed. It's a solid piece of, say, pot metal red. So we talked about Tiffany and what he wanted to do in making landscape windows. Well, if the history of stained glass for 1500 years had been for the glorification of God, then you wanted bright glass of red and ambers and blues and purples. You would stain them to tone them down for your biblical scenes, figurative scenes, for the robes, for the shading, for detail. But in essence, the glass was bright colors of cathedrals and antique blown glass. Tiffany wanted organic glass, and so he had to invent a type of glass that was opaque and also earthy and had strange striations. So these types of glass were invented by the Tiffany Studios, opalescent. And it's said that John Lafarge, also another great stained glass person, was the first one to take, I think there were either makeup or maybe it's medicine bottles that were white glass, and crush those up and add them to the cathedral glass that was in the furnace. And then you get a white that's mixed with your color, and it makes it opaque so you can't see through it. And Tiffany got all the glory and fame, but actually it was John Lafarge, they say, that had the first idea for opalescent glass. But glass is very heat sensitive, and so the way you cool it and the way you can bombard it with extra chemicals and make the crystallization growth grow in the glass according to how long it's hot, makes the glass do some really strange organic things. And this is called mottled glass. And this was one of the glasses that Tiffany Studios was the most famous for. And there's a crystalline growth in there that's heat related. So when you roll the sheet out and it starts to shrink and cool on the steel table, the part of the sheet that's touching the table the longest chills the fastest. The part that arches up and gets airborne stays hotter longer, and the colors get to grow in it longer. So that's one of the ways that this glass can be modeled, is just the way it's rolled out and the way it kind of shrinks on the table as it cools. The colors grow in these ring models. So this is a green opalescent glass. And this is a red opalescent with a little, two furnaces going. You take a ladle of each and you throw them on the table, and it's like cracking an egg. You have these two globs of glass, and you take steel tongs and poke it and stir it a little bit, and then roll it out into a sheet, and you get the striations tumbling and squeezing out, and it makes these strange combinations of color. If you just took a furnace and loaded it up with white and green and stirred it up and melted it and rolled it out, it would just be a solid color. There'd be no streaks or striations in it. So in working in a factory, which I did at Euroburrows Glass Factory for a while, it was really fascinating to make this glass and learn how to do it. And one of the things that's really interesting is when you have these different furnaces on one side of the room and over here is the steel rolling table, you have to ladle the glass out and almost work out your choreography as to who goes first or who goes at the same time and what are you going to do by the time you meet at the table, and everybody blops their glass on the table at the same time, and who's going to pick up the steel tongs and poke the glass, and who's going to roll the sheet out, and who's going to pick it up with the steel tongs and like pizza put it in the oven and anneal it. So it's pretty fascinating when you start thinking about all the techniques that were figured out by the tradesmen back at the turn of the century. Drapery glass that Tiffany is famous for and that you'll see at the church today. Drapery glass is to emulate the folds in fabric, obviously. So if you take your glass and you take your rolling pin and you start doing this as you're going across the sheet, you can wad it up and make these big ripples. It's really a pain to cut, but you can if you're diligent and you have a lot of glass to break and keep using new glass. I should have warned you, glass is sharp, so as these pieces go around the room, don't rub your finger up and down on the sharp edge. Try and hold them like a glass worker would, firmly, without it letting it rotate. Another glass that Tiffany Studios invented was fracture glass and fracture streamer glass. And fracture glass is where you take your glass blowing pipe and you blow a bubble and you blow it too big and it gets so thin that it pops. And then you just collect all the little shards of like cornflakes of little glass, and then you throw them on the table, and then you ladle your glass on top of that and roll your sheet over it. And the hot glass melts those little shards into the back side of your sheet of glass. So if you want to have a flower that's just depicted with, where'd it go? Just you're cutting your glass into the shape of the flower petals. That's one way to do it, but if you're at Tiffany Studios and you want a giant lattice work of clematis and off in the background, or clematises that are out of focus, you would have the same colors of your flowers in your confetti glass stuck in the background that would look like flowers off in a distance, or leaves, or whatever you want it to be. But that's what confetti fracture glass was for. So, this is a machine-made, meaning this wasn't hand-rolled, so the ripples are real consistent. I won't pass this one around, it's really sharp. But this is made by Bullseye Glass Factory in Portland. This is a Euroburls, another piece of hand-rolled rippled glass. And this is called herringbone ripple. And what you do is you're rolling the glass, you make your roller go back and forth, and it stretches out the ripples in these strange chevron patterns. So if you're doing a Tiffany window and you want ferns down in the foreground, you could cut a big long piece along this line and all the ripples go like the fern petals would be. Or if you turn that over and you want to make a fir tree off in the background, you cut your fir tree with all your ripples going upward, and you can get the effects that you want. Herringbone ripple. So we were talking about contaminants with clear glass. Manganese is an element that's susceptible to ultraviolet light, and it darkens with age, exposure. So this was clear glass that was in the lead came, and what was out of the sunlight stayed clear. And what stayed in the sun turned this purple light rose tint. So I'll pass this around. This was a clear hammered cathedral. Hammered is the name of every single texture on glass has a name. You won't believe it, but it goes on and on and on and on. And every factory has 10 different names, and so when you have 20 factories, all of a sudden there's 200 names out on the market. But hammered is the texture that they have on the roller. So when the roller goes across the sheet of glass, it stamps in the glass a particular texture. And that glass had manganese in it, and when they made it, they didn't know it. They just thought it was clear. And so we went to a cathedral to work on their stained glass windows and repair these gray pieces of glass that had broken. So we got up on the scaffold and pulled the glass out and took them back to the studio. And when we got them back, we soaked them in water, and we took our putty knives and razor knives, and we cleaned all the putty off the edges, and all of the edges were turquoise. So the glass originally in that cathedral was turquoise, but it had manganese contaminant in it. So you mix manganese, you mix turquoise and purple, and it makes a gray. So all these pieces of glass were this strange color of gray in amongst all these other beautiful colors, and whereas originally they were meant to be turquoise. So manganese can affect other glass than just clear. This is one of the pieces of glass that came out of the other parts of that window. And if you look closely at the edge, actually, you're not going to be able to see. I was going to say this will show you how the glass is clear, and then it has the design silk screened on it in the black trace, and that's fired, and then the color is painted on there, the blue enamel, and that's fired. And then years and years of weatherization is starting to etch and frost the glass and make the stain dissolve off of it. So from all these samples, anybody have some questions now? Good. Okay, so moving on, we have right here blown crackle glass. And this is where the glass blower takes that large bubble of glass when it's about this big and about that thick, and he dunks it into a bucket of water. And the water shatters the glass, and it just erupts into this big steaming volcano. And he takes that bubble out, and it's gone from a bright yellow down to a dark brown. And he goes back to the furnace, and he puts it in, and he heats it up to where it's nice and bright yellow again, and then blows this big bubble. And it has all the chill marks from when it cracked. And that's how they make that crackle glass. And in the Victorian days, that was the cat's meow. People just loved to use crackle glass in their stained glass windows. Here's a shard of a remnant of a Povey Brothers stained glass window. And it's got crackle glass, machine rippled glass, red blown flashed glass, and then this pressed jewel in the center. I sandwiched this in between two pieces of plexiglass and screwed it together so that it will hold together. The thing that's nice about the crackle glass is each little section that has a crack around it is kind of scooped out, so they're like little lenses. So optically, the glass really twinkles and moves. So if you're in front of a big window of crackle glass and outside a branch on a tree moves, the whole window starts to do this little dance.
So the regular windows that are in old houses that everybody thinks are so awesome and do strange things, was it just the table they were rolled out on, or?
Yeah, and I'll pass around an example of that. It's really in demand now, the old wavy glass. And so I brought a piece, well, this big piece. This came out of a greenhouse. So the glass was stacked like shingles. And so the upper piece, where the dirt came around the water and the dirt, it kind of etched the glass, and that's permanently on there. But if you look at the piece, you can see some little wrinkles. And then if you look at something and you turn the glass this way and move it, you can see how the image dances. So this is the old wavy glass. And then they started making glass where it came out and it was called float glass, and it's on a little puddle of tin, liquid tin. And it can solidify on that and not have these wrinkles in it. And so float glass is the newer glass. So I'll pass this around, but we're starting to have customers that prefer that their clear glass in their windows have that little wrinkle, and it's really cool. We go out to salvage places and buy sashes and then take the glass out and cut around the big scratches and make windows with the old wavy glass. So this is a medieval style of old wavy glass. This is out of a window. You can see where the old putty was around the edge. But when you put your materials into the furnace and you melt them, the first thing it does is, as it melts, it foams up. And if you roll your glass out at that point, you get all the bubbles in the glass, and that's called seedy. interior designers love to use CD glass, and lots of lanterns have CD glass in them because it makes the light a little more diffuse and dances a little bit. So CD clear. When glass is made by a glass blower, it's using a technique they've used for about 500 years, so they call that glass antique glass. So of your classifications of glass, you can have antique glass, cathedral glass, which is just a transparent rolled glass, like this English muffle is a cathedral. The texture is put on it by the rolling pin that squeezed this out. Then you have opalescent glass, where you can have an amber cathedral like that, but you mix white with it, and then it's an opalescent. So this is amber opalescent. And the texture on this is called cat's paw granite. And cat's paw granite was the texture that was popularized by the Kokomo glass factory at the turn of the century. And then about in the 1930s, they updated their machinery and they took the textures off these rollers. They took these rollers and put them in the field behind the factory and put new textures on. And so in the 1970s, when people started restoring old American stained glass windows, they demanded that texture be made again so they could match the glass. So they went out in the field, brought in those old rollers and started using them again. So now you can buy cat's paw granite.
So these center little,
Jewel, they call them jewels.
they're made a different way, obviously.
Yeah, the little dollops of glass that are pressed into a steel mold. And if they're faceted, lots of times they have a little machine that can facet them. It's like a record player, has an arm, and you have your little glass thing out there, your little glob of glass, and it goes down onto the polisher, and it comes up and turns and goes down and comes up and puts all these facets on the glass and polishes it. So you can press it into a mold that has those faceted edges, or you can press it into the mold and then take it and buff them out and make them nice and crisp. And a lot of the old jewels, you can see a little striation on the faceted planes so that you know that they buffed them out. So I'll pass around these jewels. These are antique ones in this little package here. Antique meaning they're probably about 70 to 100 years old. And they're thicker than the most common jewels that you can buy now. Most jewels are made in Czechoslovakia and Germany. And then the colors in these are unique. This lime green one is made with radium, and this one is made with gold. The other two are made with fluorine for the white. And also popular, besides those faceted jewels, which are called route and rose, are these pressed jewels, where there's just globs of glass that are pressed into a steel mold. And the one right here on the end, this is how individual ones are made. And it's actually a little oval jewel, and that's the glob of glass, and they would cut and break the rest of that glass off, and you would just end up with the oval. But these other ones are made the same way, and they've had that excess glass broken off. So those are all the different textures that were popular in the old days. And faceted jewels are a little newer on the market than the pressed jewels. The pressed jewels you can see in the earlier American windows. In this little baggie I have, an antique rondel. Antique meaning it's one that the Povey brothers used probably from like 1900. A clear rondel, a piece of beveled glass, a pinched jewel, which is the Tiffany Studios, a little square pinched jewel. It looks like somebody took some clay or something and pinched it. And then some glazing nails. And glazing nails are what we use to hold the window down on the table as we build it. And I'll show you when I work on this, but horseshoe nails are easy to go in and easy to come out of wood, and they have a flat edge, so when they're up against the glass, they don't chip it and break it so much. So I think, show and tell wise, here's a little more. These are some rondels. These are some turtlebacks. And there's a blue iridized turtleback and a green opalescent turtleback. Tiffany Studios invented turtlebacks for lanterns, lampshades, mosaics on, say, a fireplace front. So if you are into antique lighting and you know about Tiffany turtleback lamps, those would be appealing.
So, Italian artisans over in Milano, wherever they're at,
Yeah.
they're blowing glass and they're putting gold in it, like a wire or something. How does that happen?
I don't know.
Okay.
I have to tell you, at Eurobros Glass Factory, I have seen gold coins melted down in a beaker of acid with a Bunsen burner, or dissolved in a beaker of acid, and then you end up with a white powder. And you take that white powder and you dump it into a big 55-gallon drum of silica and your glass, and you melt that down and you get a super dark pink glass. And you roll sheets of that up and you cut them into little squares, and then you can have a furnace of clear glass or a furnace of white glass. And you can take that little piece of pink cullet and throw it in there and watch it melt, and when it gets hot and starts to sink, you grab it with the ladle and throw it on the table and roll it out, and you get a beautiful pink sheet of glass. So the wire in the blown piece, I don't know what it does.
I don't even know if it was really a wire.
Oh.
It's like that.
Oh, well, maybe they just have a thread of pink glass. Yeah. Pulled and feathered is the name of the technique, where they can take a blown piece and spin glass around it, and then take a hook and drag the design and torque it and make it look like feathers or leaves or things like that. So these are the hammers that are used to cut Dalle de Verre glass. I'm not going to do it here because I'd have to give you all safety glasses. But what you do is you take this glass onto an anvil and you whack it, and you basically lop it into the shape you want. And then when you get closer to the size you want, you're chipping it down smaller and smaller, and then you nap the glass by hitting on the edge, and it's like making a arrowhead. And you chip it on the edge, and it's those chips that make the glass sparkle. So on this little dulled window, if I put the light, you can see the chips fire up and sparkle. This is glass made in Portland by Euroburls Glass for this Tiffany window. And the technique on the water is called plating. So there's a rippled glass on one layer, and on the back there's another layer of glass that's added on that's blue and white opalescent. And so it makes that glass streaky. So if you can't get the effect in one layer of glass, you can get it by putting two layers of glass together. So these are real common uses of flash glass, and that's nameplates. So these are broken nameplates that have come out of old windows that I've reproduced. But this is a purple flashed glass that's been acid etched, and they etched through the purple down to the clear, and then black tracing was painted around the edge of each letter, and then a gray mat across the face of the piece, and then it's fired in the kiln. This is from the same church, a different nameplate. It is not the will of your Father which is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. It's interesting, there was a time when, you probably know this better than I, but everybody was born in the world with guilt. And if you didn't accept Christ in your life and you died, you didn't go to heaven. But then there was an exception made for babies. And so all of a sudden cherubs became very popular as a design element in church windows. And I think that is related to that. If I knew more about the Bible, I would know the scripture Matthew, what Matthew, whatever that is, means. So we know the glass is very heat sensitive, and if you want to grind and polish glass, if you take it up to a grinder and start working on it, it's going to get hot. You can see the little red glow start, and all of a sudden the glass breaks. So if you want to work on glass, you have to keep it cold, and it's usually water-fed grinders. And it's the water-fed grinders that are used to bevel glass. And so glass beveling, these are two pieces of antique beveled glass. One is thicker, one is thinner. When you hold them up to the light, you can get a little bit, even though there's no sunlight today, a little bit of color off the thick one, but no color off the thin one. The more shallow the beveled edge, the less color you get off of it. The steeper it is, the more color you get. So you want a thicker piece of glass that has a steeper pitch to the bevel. And so my friend Dan Woodward in Portland bevels glass, and he's been beveling for 40 years, and I have no idea how he's done that. If you go to his studio, first of all, it smells like a wet dog. And there's just this big room of all these cast iron machines with these big stones. And over every machine is this sheet metal funnel full of different colored mud. And there's a little bucket of water that drips onto that bucket of mud, and that mud falls onto that wheel, and it splatters it all around. So he's wearing rubber apron and rubber boots, and everything is muddy and gooey and smelly. And he takes that piece of glass and he goes from one stone and grinds and polishes it to the next stone, to the next stone, finer and finer till he finally goes to a cork wheel and puts the final buff on the bevel. And it's amazing. He is a perfectionist. He can miter, he can make jewels, these faceted jewels. Whenever I can use his work, I try and talk my customers into it. It's expensive, but it's fabulous. So this beveled, this is an antique one. Don't cut yourself on the edge. This is something I repaired and put a new one into the window. This is called either zipper cut or beaded bevel, and the really fancy windows have this. And this is a bevel that's not totally transparent because they glue chipped the surface of it. And so it's an obscured piece of clear glass, but a beveled edge, so you can still get the rainbows off of it. So we talked about crackle glass and hammered glass. So glue chip is another texture. And glue chip is a bizarre glass in that they take clear glass, and probably in the old days they acid etched it, but nowadays they sandblast it and they put a texture on it. And then they paint it with a horse hoof glue or animal hide glue that doesn't smell very well. And when that glue dries, they warm it up and then they blow cold air on it, and the glue shrinks and chips the surface of the glass off. And when it does that, it sounds like wind chimes, but it chips it all up. This is a sharp edge on this one, so be careful, but that's glue chip. And they can, in the old days, they could use that for signage. So in a barber shop or a pub or something, they could have a big window and then have sandblasted the name Joe's, and then come back and painted horsehoof glue on it and then chipped it. So when you walk up at Joe's establishment, you see his name in glue chip in the middle of his plate glass window.